So I did some controlled experiments where we had a series of photographs corresponding to words the parrot knows.
Yeah.
She sat in one room. The photos were in sealed envelopes, randomized.
Mm-hmm.
So she'd open an envelope. She didn't know in advance what was in it. It might be a picture of a car.
Mm-hmm.
And the parrot in another room was being filmed. And the question was, would it say car
Mm-hmm.
or flower or whatever she was looking at? And the answer is yes, it did. And it did much more than you'd expect by chance. So this is this series of experiments showed that this parrot was indeed telepathic and could pick up and actually say in English
Right.
what its owner was looking at.
So, if we just mention the skeptics, because I know obviously in this field you have your share of them.
Oh yes.
I mean, what would they have you published a paper on this parrot research?
Oh yes, yes. It's published. All my stuff's published in peer-reviewed journals.
Mm-hmm.
So normal science involves skepticism. So when you publish them, you have referees who read them and they check to see if there's any faults in the statistics and stuff. So they've all been vetted.
Yeah.
But there are a whole group of deniers out there, so-called skeptics, who are actually dogmatic believers in materialism, who think that psychic phenomena are impossible.
Right.
Now, those kinds of skeptics are not open to evidence, in my experience.
Right.
For example, when I did this parrot research, I published it, and there was a TV program about it on Discovery Channel.
Right.
And they wanted to get a comment from a skeptic, because in the media they always ask a media skeptic to comment. And they got Professor Lewis Wolpert, who's a biologist at University College London. And they rang him up and they said, Rupert Sheldrake's done this research and he says this parrot's psychic. And Wolpert just said, oh, it must be nonsense. Mm-hmm. And they said, would you like to look at the videotape of the experiment to comment? He said, oh, I don't need to see the evidence. He said, I know it's rubbish. And then he just appeared on TV and said, there's absolutely no evidence that telepathy exists in any animal or person or thing. Yeah. It's completely impossible. Yeah. And so the point is that kind of skepticism comes very cheap. I mean, he didn't need to bother to look at the facts. He doesn't need to concern himself with the evidence. He knows what he thinks. His mind's made up. Yeah. Well, I challenged him to a public debate at the Royal Society of Arts. There was a judge in the chair. And it turned out he knew absolutely nothing about this field, and he didn't feel he needed to because he was so sure it was impossible. Now, that kind of skepticism is what I encounter all the time. Yes. I mean, it's one thing to have somebody who says, I've looked at your data and maybe there was a mistake here and the statistics aren't right here and you could have designed the experiment better here. That's fine. That's normal science, and I'm used to that as every scientist is used to that. Yeah. But there's this kind of denialist skepticism which simply won't look at the evidence, and that I don't think of as real skepticism at all. It's a kind of dogmatic belief system.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Now, I've actually, there's just something I'd want to share with you, because I was very intrigued by the fact that your long-term memory may well be somewhere outside of your neural network, shall we say. And let me just explain this to you. Your short-term memory, they say, is in your frontal lobe. You know, if you're making a cup of tea, you remember where you've put the teacup. And your habit-type memory, so to remember how you drive a car, is I think in the cerebellum. So these are fairly well understood. But your long-term memory, where you're remembering, say, things from your childhood, they say that there's the part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is used in formulating those long-term memories. Yes. But they somehow end up somewhere else in the brain, but no one seems to know how they get from this hippocampus to elsewhere in the brain. Yes. Now, I thought, well, possibly the hippocampus is pushing out the memory into some other space or some other dimension, and that the rest of the brain is then a receiver to that at some other point in time. Now, I then looked into what research had been done on this thing called the hippocampus, and over the last 5 years, scientists have done quite a lot of research into rat hippocampus. Yes. Now, what they've found is that certain cells inside the rat hippocampus are called grid cells, and the reason why they call them that, if they put a little device on the cell to measure its electrical activity, and they just let the rat wander around a room, it basically, they will get an increase in voltage at certain points in space, and what it does is it maps out this grid. So if it was to walk around the room for several hours, the grid cells are triggered at these points, and it maps out a perfect hexagonal triangular grid system. Now, what the scientists say is the reason why the purpose for that is for its navigation to get from A to B. Now I think you see your navigation is done by another part of the brain. I can't remember what it is, but it's not necessarily the hippocampus. And there was this guy called Henry Mollison, and he had both his hippocampus removed, and they were non-functioning, and he didn't lose any of his spatial awareness. Okay, so you would by this argument you would say, well, he should have lost all of his spatial awareness. Now, but what this guy did, he lost his ability to create long-term memory. So he couldn't remember what he'd done a week ago, okay, because his hippocampus wasn't formulating those memories. But he could remember what he did 5 years ago because his hippocampus was working at that point in time, you see, because it had formulated the memory. So the other thing about the hippocampus is, I'm an electrical engineer, it's packed full of zinc. And zinc is the only metal which has negative resistance. So you can actually make a radio transmitter out of a piece of zinc. So I'm thinking that this grid is actually the mechanism that it's using to tap into the space. You know what I mean? That these are maybe access points to where the memory is being stored, perhaps. And but every science paper that I read, this is to do with spatial awareness, this grid. So I just wanted to...
Oh yes, well I know, I've been tracking this literature too. I think what my reading of it was this, that in order to build up a memory, you've got to associate things together. What you recall is what the associations you've made at the time. If you don't make them in the first place, you can't recall them. So like when you meet a new person, most English people are hopeless at remembering names. They're introduced to somebody and they instantly forget. Now Americans are different. You know, if you meet if I meet somebody in America, they say, "Hi, Rupert." Well, "How are you today, Rupert?" They keep repeating it, so they get it. And next time you meet them, they can remember your name. It's very impressive. Now the thing is, you have to create the associations to remember them. Now, what happens? The hippocampus has a kind of spatial map in it, and when you encounter something in a particular place, there's an activity in the hippocampus that links it to the sights and smells and things, all the other aspects of that thing. They all get linked together, and the hippocampus seems to be the place that links them together to create this resonant pattern inside the brain. It's a kind of resonant pattern of activity. Now, what happens then is that they've mapped all that, they've shown it happens and stuff, brain scientists. But then after you've had that experience, you move on to some other experience. The hippocampus are creating other resonant patterns. And the first one isn't in the hippocampus anymore. So then they assume it must have been shunted off into some other part of the brain for long-term storage, which they can't find, as you rightly say. They can't find it there. I don't think it's there at all. I think it works by resonance. The hippocampus sets up a resonant pattern that links things together in a kind of spatial way. And then when you remember it, you tune into that. Now, if people lose their hippocampus, then they can't set up these new resonant patterns like this chap you mentioned. And in experiments with rats, they've found you can train rats to learn new mazes and where things are, and they need the hippocampus for that. But you can cut the hippocampus out after that, and they can still remember, which is why they say, well, the memory must be somewhere else. Well, it is somewhere else. It's not in the brain at all, in my view, rather than being in some undefined other bit of the brain.
And are there... I've heard of stories of people having an entire hemisphere removed, and they can remember almost everything. Is that...
Yes. Well, I mean, the point is that's happened in experiments with rats. In the 30s and 40s, people were desperately trying to trace memories in the brain, and they trained rats to learn new tricks, and then cut out various bits of the brain, the right, the left, the front, the back, and stuff. And they found that when the rat had recovered from the operation, it could still remember, even after big chunks of the brain had been removed. And that's why they came to the conclusion that as they said, memory seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in particular, because you couldn't pin it down in a particular place. And some people said, well, it must be stored holographically in the brain. A hologram is where you have a kind of photo interference pattern in a photo. And even if you cut half of a hologram off, you can still get back the same image. Each bit contains information from the whole.
Right.
So I don't think it's holographic, because that's still the theory, it's stored in the brain, but they're trying to explain the fact you can't pin it down. I'd go further. I'd say it's not in the brain at all, which is why you can't locate the exact memory stores.
And if this is the case, then, you know, you then have this, you just philosophically speaking, what would happen if you connected to the wrong person? You connected to someone else's brain memory. So there must be some kind of umbilical cord keeping us all connected to our own memories. Do you see? I mean,
well, I think that's similarity. You see, the umbilical cord I don't think is an actual cord. I think it's the fact you're more similar to you yesterday and last year and when you were a child than you are to me. That's why you have your own memories, because you resonate with yourself.
right.
Now, if you had serious brain damage, an accident that disrupted your brain and changed the way it resonates, you might conceivably pick up other people's memories. And there are cases of people who have accidents who have extraordinary abilities they didn't have beforehand. I read a case just yesterday where somebody had a major accident to the brain. They were unconscious, and when they came round, they could speak fluent Italian, whereas before the brain injury, they only had a very sketchy knowledge of the language.
Really?
And I would think that what was happening there, they were somehow resonating with Italian speakers, that it had sort of changed the normal tuning. I mean, it's as if you always watch, say, Channel 4 on TV, and then you drop the TV, it has an accident, and from there on it's stuck on BBC One.
Yeah.
You can't get Channel 4 anymore.
Yeah.
It would be something like that. But so I think normally we tune into ourselves, but accidents could possibly alter the tuning to some degree.
So just give us your website address, Rupert, and the books that you've written.
My website's www.sheldrake.org, SHELDRAKE. My book on animals, Unexplained Powers, is called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. My book on the unexplained human abilities, telepathy, premonitions, and the sense of being stared at, is called The Sense of Being Stared At.
Okay.
And my book on memory in nature, morphic resonance, is called A New Science of Life.
Okay. All right. Is there anything you want to add, Rupert?
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing. I've just launched a new experiment on telephone telepathy. This is one of the things I do research on. A lot of people have the experience of thinking of someone who then rings. They say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you.
Yeah.
It's about 80% of people have had that experience. Now, I've been doing experiments on telephone telepathy for the last 5 or 6 years, and they show that this is real. It's not just coincidence and people forgetting all the times they're wrong.
Right.
Something's really going on. I've just launched a new automated test on telephone telepathy, which works on mobile phones.
Right.
And so I'd like to mention that, because anyone who's viewing this in the UK or in the US can do that test. It only works in the UK and the US at the moment.
Right.
To do it, you go to my website, www.sheldrake.org, go to the online experiments portal, go to the mobile telephone telepathy test. You put in the names of 2 friends or family members who've got mobile phones and their phone numbers, and the computer picks one of them at random, sends them a text message and asks them to ring you. You then get a phone call from the computer that says, one of your 2 callers is on the line right now waiting to speak to you.
Right.
Please guess who it is by pressing 1 or 2 on your keypad.
Right.
So you guess who it is. Then the line opens up, you can speak to them. So you find out instantly if you're right or wrong. And then after a minute it cuts off because I'm paying for the call.
All right.
and after a random time delay, it does the same thing again. So you do 6 of these trials.
Right.
It takes less than an hour.
Right.
So it's fun to do. It's free. I mean, of course, you have to pay for the mobile phone calls, but they're only to landlines.
Right.
And it's on my website. And anyone can do this. So I'd invite anyone who's at all interested in these things to try the experiment for themselves.
And when do you envisage publishing the results from that, Rupert?
Well, it depends. I want to get at least 1,000 trials before I do that. So it rather depends on getting enough volunteers to do the test. So
well,
this
should help. This should help.
This should help.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Thanks for speaking to me today,
Pleasure.
Rupert. Short, but absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.